May 7th, 1915, 1400 hours, and Captain William Turner stands on the bridge of RMS Lusitania watching the Irish coastline emerge from the morning mist, believing he's steering the world's most magnificent ocean liner toward Liverpool, through waters that should be safe from German attack. The Lusitania carries 1,959 souls, families returning from New York, businessmen heading to wartime Britain, mothers clutching children who've never seen their father's homeland, and a cargo manifest that includes everything from cheese to copper to rifle cartridges. Captain Turner has every reason to believe they'll dock safely tomorrow morning because the Lusitania is fast, capable of outrunning any submarine, protected by British naval doctrine that says merchant ships remain off-limits to unrestricted warfare, and guarded by the implicit understanding that civilized nations don't murder civilians at sea. What Captain Turner cannot possibly know, what no merchant captain could imagine in their darkest nightmares, is that 11 miles off the old head of Kinsale, Captain Lieutenant Walter Schweiger is tracking the Lusitania through U-20's periscope, his finger hovering over the firing mechanism, about to unleash a single torpedo that will kill 1,198 people in 18 minutes and push neutral America toward a war that will reshape the 20th century. The German Navy's confidence in unrestricted submarine warfare comes from desperation, from Britain's naval blockade that's slowly strangling Germany's economy, from Kaiser Wilhelm II's belief that England can be forced to negotiate if her shipping is destroyed, and from the calculation that America's protests can be managed if victory comes quickly enough. Captain Lieutenant Walter Schweiger, commanding U-20 from the cramped confines of his submarine, has been patrolling the Irish coast for days, sinking small freighters and fishing vessels according to prize rules that require warning and safe passage for crews. But those rules are about to be abandoned when he sees 4 smokestacks on the horizon. U-20 represents the cutting edge of German naval technology in 1915, a Type U-19 submarine displacing 650 tons surfaced, capable of 14 knots on diesel engines and 9 knots submerged on electric motors, armed with 4 torpedo tubes and a deck gun that can destroy merchant vessels without wasting precious torpedoes. Schweiger himself is 30 years old. Lusitania began on February 4, 1915, when Germany declared the waters around Britain a war zone where any merchant ship could be sunk without warning, a response to Britain's blockade that was slowly starving Germany's civilian population. German naval strategists calculated that if they could sink 600,000 tons of Allied shipping per month, Britain would be forced to surrender within 6 months, before America could mobilize for war even if she chose to enter the conflict. This strategy represented a fundamental break with centuries of naval tradition and international law that protected civilian vessels, but Germany's high command believed the rules had changed when Britain began arming merchant ships and using them to transport war material while carrying civilian passengers as human shields. The Lusitania herself embodies this moral ambiguity, a civilian liner built with British Admiralty subsidies that required her to be convertible to an armed merchant cruiser in wartime, capable of mounting 12 6-inch guns, though she never actually carried them, registered as a merchant vessel but built to military specifications with reinforced decks and ammunition magazines. Her cargo manifest for this final voyage includes 4,200 cases of rifle cartridges manufactured by Remington Arms, 1,250 cases of empty shrapnel shell casings, 18 cases of non-explosive fuses, and various other items that technically made her a legitimate military target under the evolving rules of warfare, though this fact was carefully obscured from the American public, who saw her simply as a passenger liner. Captain William Turner, 68 years old and a veteran of 41 years at sea, knows his ship carries war material, understands that German submarines are operating off Ireland, has received multiple warnings from the British Admiralty about submarine activity in his path, but follows peacetime procedures because no one has told him exactly how to defend a passenger liner against an invisible enemy that strikes without warning. Turner represents the old school of merchant captains, men who learned their trade on sailing ships, who survived shipwrecks through skill and courage, who believe that proper seamanship and sound judgment can overcome any danger. He's already survived one sinking during his first voyage as a boy, swimming to the Irish coast when his ship went down, and he'll survive this one too, though the guilt will haunt him until his death 18 years later. The passengers aboard Lusitania from German aggression. Families fill the second and third class accommodations, Irish immigrants returning to visit relatives before the war makes travel impossible. British subjects heading home to a nation at war. Children playing on decks who have no concept that they're sailing into a war zone where the rules of civilization have been suspended. Marie Depage, a Red Cross nurse and wife of a prominent Belgian surgeon, travels in first class, returning from a fundraising tour in America to help establish field hospitals behind the lines. She's seen the cost of modern warfare in wounded soldiers and shattered civilians, but cannot imagine that the violence will reach out across the ocean to claim her life. In cabin 52, the Crompton family from Philadelphia, parents with 6 children aged 3 to 15, occupy the space with the chaos and joy of a large family on holiday, unaware that by tomorrow only the father will remain alive. The morning of May 7th begins with fog that lifts gradually as Lusitania steams northeast along the Irish coast at 18 knots, slower than her maximum speed of 25 knots because Turner is conserving coal and trying to time his arrival at Liverpool for high tide the following morning. The passengers are finishing lunch, children are playing on the promenade deck, men are smoking cigars in the lounge, women are writing letters in the library, and stewards are preparing afternoon tea, when the war that's been raging in Europe for 9 months reaches out to touch them. At 13:20 hours, First Officer Albert Arthur Jones spots a submarine periscope of the starboard bow and reports it to Captain Turner on the bridge, but the sighting is brief and inconclusive, one of dozens of reported periscope sightings that turn out to be dolphins or floating debris, and Turner maintains course because the Admiralty has ordered him to proceed at maximum safe speed through these waters. What Turner doesn't know is that Schwieger has been tracking him for an hour, manoeuvring U-20 into attack position, calculating the Lusitania's speed and course, and waiting for the perfect moment when his single torpedo, all he has remaining after days of successful attacks on smaller vessels, can strike the massive liner amidships where it will do maximum damage. At 14:10 hours, from a distance of approximately 700 metres, Schwieger gives the order to fire. The torpedo, a G-type carrying 290 pounds of hexanite explosive, leaves tube number 1 with a compressed air whoosh and begins its run toward the Lusitania at 40 knots, leaving a distinctive wake of bubbles in the area where the number 1 boiler room meets passenger accommodations. The initial explosion is massive, a thunderclap that shakes the entire 787-foot ship, followed almost immediately by a second, much larger explosion that tears through the Lusitania's interior with devastating force. This secondary blast, never adequately explained, might have been caused by the boilers rupturing from the sudden inrush of cold seawater, or by the detonation of the 4,200 cases of rifle ammunition in the cargo hold, or by coal dust in the nearly empty coal bunkers, but, whatever the cause, it rips open the ship's hull across multiple compartments and dooms her in an instant. The torpedo strike and secondary explosion kill hundreds immediately, passengers and crew members who happen to be in the wrong place when thousands of tons of steel and machinery are blown apart by forces that turn human bodies into ragdolls. In the number 1 boiler room, firemen and stokers are scalded to death by superheated steam from ruptured pipes, dying in agony in the dark as seawater floods their workspace. In the third-class dining room directly above the explosion, families eating lunch are thrown across the room by the blast, tables and chairs becoming projectiles, children torn from mothers' arms, the room filling with smoke and screams, and the terrified realization that something catastrophic has happened. On the bridge, Captain Turner feels his ship shudder beneath his feet and immediately understands that his worst nightmare has come true, that despite all his precautions and experience, a German submarine has struck his ship. He orders full astern on the engines, trying to slow the ship's forward momentum that's forcing water through the gaping wound in her hull, but discovers that the engine room has lost power, that the massive turbines are no longer responding to commands, that his ship is continuing forward at 18 knots while listing heavily to starboard. Turner shouts orders for the wireless operators to send distress signals, for crew members to prepare lifeboats, for passengers to don life jackets and proceed to boat stations, but even as he gives these commands, he knows his ship is dying too fast for orderly evacuation procedures. The Lusitania is listing 15 degrees to starboard within minutes of the torpedo strike, the massive hole in her side allowing thousands of tons of seawater to flood her interior, pulling her down by the bow while the list makes it almost impossible to launch designed to lower boats from the deck to the water, cannot function properly with the ship listing so heavily. On the port side, the list pulls boats away from the ship side so that when they're lowered, they swing inward, smashing into the hull or tangling in their own ropes. On the starboard side, the list pins boats against the davits so they cannot be moved at all, or causes them to slide down the tilted deck, crushing anyone in their path. Boat number 11 is launched successfully from the starboard side, with about 70 people aboard, but as it descends toward the water, the Lusitania's continued forward momentum causes the boat to slam into the side of the ship repeatedly, smashing holes in its hull and throwing passengers into the sea. Boat number 13 is lowered too quickly from the port side, drops bow first into the ocean and dumps everyone aboard into the cold water. Boat number 2 is successfully launched with women and children aboard, but as it pulls away from the dying ship, passengers trapped on deck watch their only hope of rescue disappear, realizing that there aren't enough boats for everyone, that the orderly evacuation they've been promised is impossible. First Officer Jones tries to organize the evacuation, shouting orders to crew members who are themselves terrified and confused, trying to maintain discipline as the deck tilts further and passengers begin to panic. He helps women and children into boats, tries to prevent men from rushing the lifeboats, attempts to create some order in the chaos, but the speed of the sinking overwhelms all efforts at orderly evacuation. Within 10 minutes of the torpedo strike, the Lusitania is listing 30 degrees, her bow is underwater, and passengers are beginning to jump from the tilting decks into the cold Atlantic. Alfred Gwynne Vanderbilt, one of the richest men in America, gives his life jacket to a woman who doesn't have one, then helps load children into lifeboats, refusing a seat for himself because there aren't enough places for everyone. He's last seen standing on the deck in his impeccable suit, smoking a cigarette as the ship goes down, choosing to die with dignity rather than fight for survival at the expense of others. Charles Frohman, the Broadway producer, stands with other men at the starboard rail as the deck begins to dip beneath the waves, reportedly quoting from Peter Pan, the play he'd produced on Broadway, "Why fear death? It is the most beautiful adventure in life." These men product why water is flooding through corridors that were carpeted and elegant just minutes before. In the third-class sections, immigrants who speak little English and have never been on a ship before are trapped below decks as water rises through passageways, unable to find their way to the boat deck, drowning in the dark as the ship rolls onto her side. The Crompton family from Philadelphia, parents and 6 children, are separated in the chaos, the children swept away by the crowd, the mother last seen screaming their names as the deck tilts beneath her feet. By the next morning, only the father will be alive, pulled from the water after clinging to wreckage for hours, his entire family gone, his life permanently shattered by 18 minutes of horror. Margaret Guire, a passenger in first class, falls from a lifeboat during the evacuation and is sucked into one of the ship's massive funnels as they collapse, only to be blown back out by an explosion of steam from the ship's boilers, shot into the air and landing in the water where she's eventually rescued, her oil-stained camisole the only physical evidence of her impossible survival. Captain Turner remains on the bridge as his ship dies beneath him, trying to slow her momentum, trying to coordinate rescue efforts, watching helplessly as the bow dips lower and the stern rises higher, knowing that he's about to lose his ship and most of the people he was responsible for protecting. At 14:28 hours, just 18 minutes after the torpedo strike, the Lusitania's bow strikes the seabed 300 feet below, and the massive liner pauses for a moment, her stern rising almost vertically out of the water, screws still turning, before sliding beneath the waves, stern first, with a roar of escaping air and collapsing metal. Turner is washed from the bridge as the ship goes under, dragged down by the suction, certain he's about to die, but somehow he reaches the surface and grabs onto a floating chair, spending 3 hours in the cold water before being pulled unconscious into a lifeboat. The water around the Lusitania's final resting place becomes a scene of indescribable horror, as over 1,000 people struggle for survival in the cold Atlantic. Life jackets keep many afloat, but hypothermia begins to kill them within the first hour. Children who survived the sinking but cannot understand why the cold water is making them so sleepy simply close their eyes and cove begin arriving within 2 hours of the sinking, pulling survivors from the water, recovering bodies, witnesses to a catastrophe that seems incomprehensible in its scale and suddenness. The fishermen, tough men accustomed to the sea's dangers, are visibly shaken by what they find. Entire families floating dead in their life jackets, children clutched in their mother's arms, both dead from the cold. Of the 1,959 people aboard the Lusitania, 1,198 die, including 128 Americans, whose deaths will eventually help drag the United States into World War I. Only 767 survive, many of them injured, traumatized, forever changed by 18 minutes that transformed a luxury liner into a mass grave. Aboard U-20, Capitan Lieutenant Schwieger watches through his periscope as the Lusitania sinks, recording in his war diary with clinical precision the details of his attack, noting the torpedo strike, the secondary explosion, the rapid sinking, the people in the water. His diary entry shows no remorse, no recognition that he's just killed over 1,000 civilians, only professional satisfaction that his single torpedo achieved such devastating results. Schwieger will later claim he believed he was attacking an armed merchant cruiser, that the 4 funnels and large size suggested a military vessel, that the secondary explosion proved she was carrying munitions, justifications that ring hollow when weighed against 1,198 dead civilians, including 94 children. The German government's response to the sinking reveals the profound disconnect between military necessity and public morality that will ultimately doom Germany's position. The German Foreign Office issues a statement claiming the Lusitania was a legitimate military target because she carried war materials and was listed in British naval registers as an armed merchant cruiser. They point to notices they'd published in American newspapers warning that ships flying British flags in the war zone did so at their own risk, suggesting that passengers who chose to sail on the Lusitania were responsible for their own deaths. Kaiser Wilhelm II, despite having approved unrestricted submarine warfare, is reportedly shocked by the death toll and international reaction, recognizing too late that sinking a passenger liner has crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. The American reaction begins with disbelief that Germany would deliberately target a civilian vessel, evolves through anger as the full death toll becomes clear, demanding an end to unrestricted submarine warfare, compensation for American dead, and guarantees that such attacks will not be repeated. Former President Theodore Roosevelt, always more hawkish than Wilson, calls the sinking an act of piracy and demands immediate entry into the war, criticism that places enormous political pressure on Wilson to abandon neutrality. But Wilson, showing remarkable restraint given the public mood, continues to pursue diplomatic solutions, believing that America can better serve the cause of peace by remaining neutral than by joining the slaughter in Europe. The sinking creates powerful anti-German sentiment in America and Britain, propaganda posters showing German soldiers bayoneting babies, submarines murdering women and children, the Hun as barbaric destroyer of civilization. British intelligence helps fuel this propaganda, ensuring that every detail of the sinking receives maximum publicity, that every dead American child is counted, that the German justifications are portrayed as the cynical lies they are. Recruiting offices in Britain see a surge of volunteers, men who might have remained civilians, now determined to fight against an enemy who murders children at sea. The long-term consequences of the Lusitania sinking extend far beyond the immediate diplomatic crisis, as the attack fundamentally changes how Americans view the European war and their potential role in it. Before May 7, 1915, most Americans saw the war as a distant European conflict that had nothing to do with them, a product of old-world imperialism and alliance systems that American isolation had wisely avoided. After the Lusitania, increasing numbers of Americans begin to see the war as a conflict between civilization and barbarism, between democratic values and militaristic aggression, between the defense of innocent life and the worship of military power. Germany, bowing to American pressure and recognizing that unrestricted submarine warfare risks bringing America into the war before Germany can win, suspends the policy in September 1915, ordering U-boat commanders to follow prize rules when attacking merchant vessels. This suspension saves American lives and temporarily diffuses the crisis, but it also reduces the effectiveness of the submarine campaign, allowing Britain to maintain its blockade and continue strangling Germany's economy. The strategic dilemma facing Germany becomes increasingly acute as the war drags on without decisive victory. They can follow international law and lose the war slowly. Passengers and crew members he was responsible for protecting, defends himself with dignity, pointing out that no one had given him specific instructions on how to defend against submarine attack, that he'd maintained speed as ordered, that no merchant captain in 1915 knew how to protect against an unseen enemy that struck without warning. The inquiry ultimately finds Turner blameless, recognizing that the true responsibility lies with the German submarine commander, who fired without warning at a passenger vessel. But Turner never fully recovers from the trauma, suffering survivor's guilt and nightmares for the rest of his life. Kapitänleutnant Walter Schwieger continues commanding U-boat operations until September 1917, when his submarine, U-88, strikes a mine in the North Sea and sinks with all hands, giving the man who killed 1,198 civilians a sailor's death that some might call justice. His war diary, recovered after the war, provides the most detailed account of the attack from the German perspective, a clinical military document that records one of history's great atrocities with the emotional detachment of an accountant tallying figures. The legal and moral questions raised by the Lusitania sinking continue to resonate more than a century later, as international law struggles to balance military necessity against humanitarian concerns. Was the Lusitania a legitimate military target because she carried ammunition? Did the passengers knowingly assume risk by sailing on a British ship through a declared war zone? Does military necessity justify killing civilians if they're being used as shields for military cargo? These questions have no simple answers, but the fundamental fact remains that Germany chose to sink a passenger liner knowing it would kill hundreds of civilians, a choice that violated every principle of civilized warfare and helped ensure Germany's ultimate defeat. The discovery of the wreck in 1993, lying on her starboard side, 300 feet below the surface, confirms many survivor accounts and provides physical evidence of the catastrophic damage inflicted by the torpedo and secondary explosion. The massive hole torn in her hull, the collapsed boiler rooms, the scattered debris field, all testify to the violence of her death. But the wreck also serves as a grave for the 1,198 people who died that day, a memorial to the moment when modern warfare demonstrated its capacity to kill civilians on an industrial scale with technological efficiency. The resumption of in November 1918, as his empire collapses, must have remembered the Lusitania sinking and wondered whether the death of 1,198 people in 18 minutes was worth the destruction of his dynasty and the defeat of his nation. American doughboys arriving in France in 1917 and 1918, many of them carrying rifles loaded with ammunition manufactured by the same companies that supplied the Lusitania's fatal cargo, fight with a determination intensified by propaganda that reminds them constantly of German barbarism at sea. The Lusitania dead, particularly the 128 Americans and 94 children, become martyrs to the Allied cause, their deaths justifying the enormous sacrifice America is about to make. Recruitment posters show the Lusitania sinking beneath the waves with the caption, "Remember the Lusitania," turning a maritime disaster into a rallying cry for a generation. The families of those who died on the Lusitania receive financial compensation from German reparations after the war, but no amount of money can replace children who drowned in the cold Atlantic, spouses who went down with the ship, parents who died trying to save their children. The Crompton family of Philadelphia, who lost 5 children and the mother, receives money that cannot begin to compensate the father who survived to bury his entire family. The Lusitania sinking represents more than just a tragedy or even a war crime. It marks a fundamental shift in the nature of warfare, where civilians become legitimate targets, where technology allows killing on scales previously unimaginable, where the rules that once limited warfare's brutality are abandoned in pursuit of victory at any cost. The torpedo that struck the Lusitania on May 7, 1915, did more than sink a ship and kill 1,198 people. It demonstrated that the 21st century would be an age of total war, where no one is truly safe, where the distinction between soldier and civilian becomes increasingly meaningless, where weapons of mass destruction make everyone a potential victim. The 18 minutes between torpedo strike and final sinking provide insufficient time for organised evacuation, insufficient time for careful thought, insufficient time for anything except panic and death, and the desperate struggle for survival. Those 18 minutes become a metaphor for how quickly civilization can collapse, as Americans realize that distance and neutrality cannot protect them from a war that kills civilians as readily as soldiers. The Lusitania transforms American public opinion in ways that diplomatic notes and distant battles could never accomplish, making the war personal, making it about American lives, making it impossible to maintain that what happens in Europe has nothing to do with America. President Wilson's evolution from neutrality to war leadership reflects this broader shift in American consciousness, as the man who campaigned on keeping America out of war eventually asks Congress to declare war because the world must be made safe for democracy. The Lusitania dead, particularly the 128 Americans, make Wilson's argument compelling in ways that abstract principles never could, providing concrete evidence that Germany threatened American lives and American values. The memory of the Lusitania persists in American consciousness long after the war ends, shaping attitudes toward Germany, influencing debates about naval warfare and international law, serving as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unrestricted warfare. When World War II brings German submarines back to American waters, the Lusitania is remembered, her sinking a warning about what happens when civilization's constraints on warfare are abandoned. The development of international laws governing warfare at sea, including protections for civilian vessels and requirements for warning before attack, can be traced directly to the Lusitania disaster and the recognition that such atrocities cannot be allowed to recur. In the final analysis, the Lusitania sinking stands as one of the pivotal moments of the 20th century, a single torpedo that changed the course of world history by demonstrating the brutality of modern warfare and pushing neutral America toward a conflict that would cost millions of lives and reshape the global order. The 1,198 people who died in 18 minutes off the Irish coast become symbols of warfare's capacity to destroy innocent life. Martyrs whose deaths helped ensure that Germany would ultimately lose the war she started. Captain Turner, standing on his bridge watching the Irish coast approach on that beautiful May afternoon, could not know that within 2 hours his ship would be gone, his passengers dead, and his life permanently scarred by 18 minutes of horror. Capitan artificial reefs, her passenger accommodations becoming home to fish and marine life that know nothing of the human tragedy that created their habitat. But above the wreck, carried on currents that flow across the Atlantic to the shores of America, the memory of the Lusitania endures, a reminder of the day when submarine warfare brought the Great War to America's doorstep, when 1,198 people died because military necessity trumped civilized restraint. When 18 minutes of violence changed the course of history and demonstrated that in modern warfare there are no true neutrals, no safe havens, no sanctuaries where civilians can be protected from war's terrible reach. The lesson of the Lusitania, learned at the cost of 1,198 lives, is that technological warfare recognizes no limits, respects no traditions, honors no sanctuaries, and that once unleashed, it will consume civilian and soldier alike until one side or the other can fight no more. America learned this lesson on May 7, 1915, and within 2 years, American soldiers were dying in French trenches, fighting a war that the Lusitania dead had made inevitable, proving that in the modern world, no ocean is wide enough to keep war at bay when civilization's restraints are abandoned in pursuit of victory.